Combray. Section 6. Sometimes I would be torn from my book in the middle of the afternoon by the gardener's daughter, who came running like a mad thing, overturning an orange tree in its tub, cutting a finger, breaking a tooth, and screaming out, "They're coming! They're coming!" so that Françoise and I should run too, and not miss anything of the show. That was on days when the cavalry stationed in Combray went out for some military exercise, going, as a rule, by the Rue Sainte Hildegarde; while our servants, sitting in a row on their chairs outside the garden railings, stared at the people of Combray taking their Sunday walks, and were stared at in return. The gardener's daughter, through the gap which there was between two houses, far away in the Avenue de la Guerre, would have spied the glitter of helmets. The servants then hurried in with their chairs, for when the troopers filed through the Rue Sainte Hildegarde, they filled it from side to side, and their jostling horses scraped against the walls of the houses, covering and drowning the pavements, like banks which present too narrow a channel to a river in flood. "Poor children!" Françoise would exclaim, in tears almost before she had reached the railings. "Poor boys, to be mown down like grass in a meadow! It's just shocking to think of," she would go on, laying a hand over her heart, where presumably she had felt the shock. "A fine sight, isn't it, Madame Françoise? All these young fellows not caring two straws for their lives?" the gardener would ask just to draw her, and he would not have spoken in vain. "Not caring for their lives, is it? Why, what in the world is there that we should care for if it's not our lives, the only gift the Lord never offers us a second time? Oh dear, you're right all the same. It's quite true, they don't care. I can remember them in '70. In those wretched wars they've no fear of death left in them. They're nothing more nor less than madmen, and then they aren't worth the price of a rope to hang them with. They're not men any more, they're lions." For by her way of thinking, to compare a man with a lion, which she used to pronounce lie on, was not at all complimentary to the man. The Rue Sainte Hildegarde turned too sharply for us to be able to see people approaching at any distance, and it was only through the gap between those two houses in the Avenue de la Guerre that we could still make out fresh helmets racing along towards us and flashing in the sunlight. The gardener wanted to know whether there were still many to come, and he was thirsty besides, with the sun beating down upon his head. So then, suddenly, his daughter would leap out as though from a beleaguered city, would make a sortie, turn the street corner, and having risked her life 100 times over, reappear and bring us, with a jug of licorice water, the news that there were still at least 1,000 of them, pouring along without a break from the direction of Thiberzy and Méséglise. Françoise and the gardener, having made up their difference, would discuss the line to be followed in case of war. "Don't you see, Françoise," he would say, "revolution would be better, because then no one would need to join in unless he liked." "Oh, yes, I can see that, certainly. It's more straightforward." The gardener believed that, as soon as war was declared, they would stop all the railways. "Yes, to be sure, so that we shan't get away," said Françoise. And the gardener would assent with, "Aye, they're the cunning ones," for he would not allow that war was anything but a kind of trick, which the State attempted to play on the people, or that there was a man in the world who would not run away from it if he had the chance to do so. But Françoise would hasten back to my aunt, and I would return to my book, and the servants would take their places again outside the gate to watch the dust settle on the pavement, and the excitement caused by the passage of the soldiers subside. Long after order had been restored, an abnormal tide of humanity would continue to darken the streets of Cornbray, and in front of every house, even of those where it was not, as a rule, done, the servants, and sometimes even the masters, would sit and stare, festooning their doorsteps with a dark, irregular fringe, like the border of shells and seaweed which a stronger tide than usual leaves on the beach, as though trimming it with embroidered crape, when the sea itself has retreated. Except on such days as these, however, I would, as a rule, be left to read in peace. But the interruption which a visit from Swann once made, and the commentary which he then supplied to the course of my reading, which had brought me to the work of an author quite new to me, called Bergotte, had this definite result, that for a long time afterwards it was not against a wall gay with spikes of purple blossom, but on a wholly different background, the porch of a Gothic cathedral, that I would see outlined the figure of one of the women of whom I dreamed. I had heard Bergotte spoken of, for the first time, by a friend older than myself, for whom I had a strong admiration, a precious youth of the name of Bloch. Hearing me confess my love of the Nuits d'Octobre, he had burst out in a bray of laughter like a bugle call, and told me by way of warning, "You must conquer your vile taste for A. de Musset, Esquire. He is a bad egg, one of the very worst, a pretty detestable specimen. I am bound to admit, natheless," he added graciously, "that he, and even the man Racine, did, each of them, once in his life, compose a line which is not only fairly rhythmical, but has also what is in my eyes the supreme merit of meaning absolutely nothing. One is La Blanche aux Lusons et la Blanche Camire, and the other La Fille de Minon et de Pasiphae. They were submitted to my judgment as evidence for the defense of the two runagates, in an article by my very dear master, Father Lecomte, who is found pleasing in the sight of the immortal gods. By which token, here is a book which I have not the time just now to read, a book recommended, it would seem, by that colossal fellow. He regards, or so they tell me, its author, one Bergotte, Esquire, as a subtle scribe, more subtle, indeed, than any beast of the field, and, albeit he exhibits on occasion a critical pacifism, a tenderness in suffering fools, for which it is impossible to account, and hard to make allowance, still his word has weight with me, as it were the Delphic oracle. Read you then this lyrical prose, and if the titanic master builder of rhythm who composed Bhagavat and the Lévrier de Magnus speaks not falsely, then by Apollo you may taste, even you, my master, the ambrosial joys of Olympus. It was in an ostensible vein of sarcasm that he had asked me to call on him, and that he himself called me my master. But as a matter of fact, we each derived a certain amount of satisfaction from the mannerism, being still at the age in which one believes that one gives a thing real existence by giving it a name. Unfortunately, I was not able to set at rest, by further talks with Bloch, in which I might have insisted upon an explanation, the doubts he had engendered in me when he told me that fine lines of poetry, from which I, if you please, expected nothing less than the revelation of truth itself, were all the finer if they meant absolutely nothing. For as it happened, Bloch was not invited to the house again. At first he had been well received there. It is true that my grandfather made out that whenever I formed a strong attachment to any one of my friends and brought him home with me, that friend was invariably a Jew, to which he would not have objected on principle, indeed his own friend Swann was of Jewish extraction, had he not found that the Jews whom I chose as friends were not usually of the best type. And so I was hardly ever able to bring a new friend home without my grandfather's humming the "O God of our fathers" from La Juive, or else "Israel, break thy chain," singing the tune alone, of course, to tum tra la, but I used to be afraid of my friends recognizing the sound, and so being able to reconstruct the words. Before seeing them, merely on hearing their names, about which, as often as not, there was nothing particularly Hebraic, he would divine not only the Jewish origin of such of my friends as might indeed be of the chosen people, but even some dark secret which was hidden in their family. "And what do they call your friend who is coming this evening?" "Dumont, Grandpapa." "Dumont! Oh, I'm frightened of Dumont!" And he would sing, "Archers, be on your guard! Watch without rest, without sound!" And then, after a few adroit questions on points of detail, he would call out, "On guard! On guard!" Or, if it were the victim himself who had already arrived, and had been obliged unconsciously by my grandfather's subtle examination to admit his origin, then my grandfather, to show us that he had no longer any doubts, would merely look at us, humming almost inaudibly the air of, "What? Do you hither guide the feet of this timid Israelite?" or of "Sweet Vale of Hebron, dear paternal fields," or, perhaps, of "Yes, I am of the chosen race." These little eccentricities on my grandfather's part implied no ill will whatsoever towards my friends. But Bloch had displeased my family for other reasons. He had begun by annoying my father, who, seeing him come in with wet clothes, had asked him with keen interest, "Why, Monsieur Bloch, is there a change in the weather? Has it been raining? I can't understand it. The barometer has been set fair." which drew from Bloch nothing more instructive than, "Sir, I am absolutely incapable of telling you whether it has rained. I live so resolutely apart from physical contingencies that my senses no longer trouble to inform me of them." "My poor boy," said my father after Bloch had gone, "your friend is out of his mind. Why, he couldn't even tell me what the weather was like. As if there could be anything more interesting! He is an imbecile!" Next, Bloch had displeased my grandmother, because after luncheon, when she complained of not feeling very well, he had stifled a sob and wiped the tears from his eyes. "You cannot imagine that he is sincere," she observed to me. "Why, he doesn't know me unless he's mad, of course." And finally, he had upset the whole household when he arrived an hour and a half late for luncheon and covered with mud from head to foot, and made not the least apology, saying merely, "I never allow myself to be influenced in the smallest degree either by atmospheric disturbances or by the arbitrary divisions of what is known as time. I would willingly reintroduce to society the opium pipe of China or the Malayan kris, but I am wholly and entirely without instruction in those infinitely more pernicious, besides being quite bleakly bourgeois implements, the umbrella and the watch." In spite of all this, he would still have been received at Combray. He was, of course, hardly the friend my parents would have chosen for me. They had, in the end, decided that the tears which he had shed on hearing of my grandmother's illness were genuine enough, but they knew, either instinctively or from their own experience, that our early impulsive emotions have but little influence over our later actions and the conduct of our lives, and that regard for moral obligations, loyalty to our friends, patience in finishing our work, obedience to a rule of life, have a surer foundation in habits solidly formed and blindly followed than in these momentary transports, ardent but sterile. They would have preferred to Bloch, as companions for myself, boys who would have given me no more than it is proper, by all the laws of middle class morality, for boys to give one another who would not unexpectedly send me a basket of fruit because they happened that morning to have thought of me with affection, but who, since they were incapable of inclining in my favor, by any single impulse of their imagination and emotions, the exact balance of the duties and claims of friendship, were as incapable of loading the scales to my prejudice. Even the injuries we do them will not easily divert from the path of their duty towards us those conventional natures of which my great aunt furnished a type, who, after quarreling for years with a niece, to whom she never spoke again, yet made no change in the will in which he had left that niece the whole of her fortune, because she was her next of kin, and it was the proper thing to do. But I was fond of Bloch. My parents wished me to be happy, and the insoluble problems which I set myself on such texts as the absolutely meaningless beauty of La Fille de Minon et de Pasiphae tired me more and made me more unwell than I should have been after further talks with him, unwholesome as those talks might seem to my mother's mind. And he would still have been received at Combray but for one thing. That same night, after dinner, having informed me a piece of news which had a great influence on my later life, making it happier at one time and then more unhappy, that no woman ever thought of anything but love, and that there was not one of them whose resistance a man could not overcome, he had gone on to assure me that he had heard it said on unimpeachable authority that my great aunt herself had led a gay life in her younger days, and had been notoriously kept. I could not refrain from passing on so important a piece of information to my parents. The next time Bloch called he was not admitted, and afterwards, when I met him in the street, he greeted me with extreme coldness. But in the matter of Bergotte he had spoken truly. For the first few days, like a tune which will be running in one's head and maddening one soon enough, but of which one has not for the moment got hold, the things I was to love so passionately in Bergotte's style had not yet caught my eye. I could not, it is true, lay down the novel of his which I was reading, but I fancied that I was interested in the story alone, as in the first dawn of love, when we go every day to meet a woman at some party or entertainment, by the charm of which we imagine it is that we are attracted. Then I observed the rare, almost archaic phrases which he liked to employ at certain points, where a hidden flow of harmony, a prelude contained and concealed in the work itself, would animate and elevate his style. and it was at such points as these, too, that he would begin to speak of the vain dream of life, of the inexhaustible torrent of fair forms, of the sterile, splendid torture of understanding and loving, of the moving effigies which ennoble for all time the charming and venerable fronts of our cathedrals; that he would express a whole system of philosophy, new to me, by the use of marvelous imagery, to the inspiration of which I would naturally have ascribed that sound of harping which began to chime and echo in my ears, an accompaniment to which that imagery added something ethereal and sublime. One of these passages of Bergotte, the third or fourth which I had detached from the rest, filled me with a joy to which the meagre joy I had tasted in the first passage bore no comparison, a joy which I felt myself to have experienced in some innermost chamber of my soul, deep, undivided, vast, from which all obstructions and partitions seemed to have been swept away. For what had happened was, that while I recognized in this passage the same taste for uncommon phrases, the same bursts of music, the same idealist philosophy which had been present in the earlier passages without my having taken them into account as the source of my pleasure, I now no longer had the impression of being confronted by a particular passage in one of Bergotte's works, which traced a purely bi-dimensional figure in outline upon the surface of my mind, but rather of the ideal passage of Bergotte, common to every one of his books, and to which all the earlier similar passages, now becoming merged in it, had added a kind of density and volume, by which my own understanding seemed to be enlarged. Part 2, Section 6.